The rise of William the Conqueror, from bastard boy to medieval powerhouse. Imagine being a child surrounded by wolves, not the furry kind, but scheming lords, treacherous knights, and ruthless enemies. How does a boy with the ominous nickname William the Bastard rise to conquer one of the most powerful kingdoms in Europe? What twists of fate, daring schemes, and audacious decisions transformed a vulnerable orphan into the first Norman king of England? This is not just the story of a medieval ruler. It's the tale of a boy navigating a minefield of betrayal, surviving assassination attempts, and turning his so-called shame into an unbreakable banner of triumph. Why did a mere pilgrimage alter the destiny of a young duke? How did he outmaneuver enemies determined to see him dead? And what secrets of Normandy's land of wolves forged William into a conqueror? From the blood-soaked lands of Normandy to the pivotal moment at Hastings, we'll unravel the thrilling journey of a man who refused to let his past define him. What would it take to not just survive among wolves, but to lead them? Stay with us as we explore the rise of William the Bastard, a tale of survival, schemes, and seizing destiny. The year was 1027, or perhaps 1028, a time when dates were as slippery as a Norman eel. In the modest town of Falaise, nestled in the rolling hills of Normandy, a child was born who would shake the very foundations of medieval Europe. His name? William. Not yet the conqueror, not yet the bastard, just William. But let's set the scene first. Normandy in the early 11th century was a curious concoction of Viking blood and French finesse. The region, dominated by the Seine River as it flowed from Paris to the English Channel, was ruled by the powerful Robert of Normandy, a man whose ambitions were only rivaled by his romantic escapades. And it was one such escapade that led to the birth of our protagonist. Robert of Normandy, often called Robert the Magnificent, a title he may have bestowed upon himself, was a descendant of Hrolfr Ragnvald's son, better known as Rollo the Viking. Rollo had stormed into the lower Seine Valley in the late 9th century, not content to merely raid and plunder like other Vikings. Instead, he stayed, settled, and struck a deal with Charles III of France in 911. Charles, tired of dealing with Rollo's raids, offered him land in exchange for loyalty. And so, Rollo became the first Count of Normandy, a title that eventually evolved into Duke. Rollo's transformation was profound. He converted to Christianity, swapping Norse paganism for the cross, and his descendants adopted French language and culture. Yet the Normans retained their Viking boldness, blending it with the sophisticated legal and cultural traditions of the Franks. By the time Robert took the helm as Duke in 1027, Normandy had become a formidable duchy with its own unique identity, a mix of Norse audacity and Gallic charm. Robert's eye for beauty brought him to Herleva, a woman of mysterious origins. Some said she was a servant in Falaise, others whispered that she was the daughter of a local tradesman or even a minister in Robert's court. What we know for sure is that their union was not sanctified by the church. And so, when Herleva gave birth to William, the child was branded bastardus, a label that would haunt and define him throughout his life. But let's not pity young William too much. Despite his illegitimacy, Robert recognized him as his heir. This was no small matter in an age where bloodlines were scrutinized more rigorously than the king's treasury. The boy grew up amidst knights and courtiers, learning the art of war, diplomacy, and intrigue. To understand William's rise, we must appreciate the legacy of his ancestors. Hrolfr, or Rollo, was no ordinary Viking. By settling in Normandy, he established a dynasty that retained its warrior ethos while embracing French sophistication. Normandy's fertile lands, strategic location, and martial culture made it a powerhouse in medieval Europe. The Normans were a paradoxical people. They spoke French but carried Viking steel. They followed Christian laws but revered their Norse heritage. Their culture blended Roman legal principles, Germanic tribal traditions, and Scandinavian audacity, creating a unique identity that would influence Europe for centuries. Even their name Normans derived from Northmen, a nod to their Viking origins. Normandy in the 11th century wasn't a place for the weak or the meek. Imagine a land where power was measured in castles, knights, and the sharpness of your sword, or your wit. Lords schemed, peasants toiled, and assassins lurked in the shadows. For young William, born in 1027 or 1028 to Robert I, Duke of Normandy, and Herleva, the stakes were high from the moment he could toddle. His lineage, though noble, was complicated by a slight technicality. He was illegitimate. This inconvenient detail would be a thorn in his side for much of his life, earning him the nickname William the Bastard. William's childhood was far from ordinary or safe. Imagine an 8-year-old boy attending ceremonial events where grown men, feudal lords, bowed before his father, only to exchange murderous glances behind his back. At just 7 or 8 years old, William was already being groomed for leadership, standing by his father's side during ceremonies where vassals swore fealty. Little did he know, those very men would later scheme to kill him. One of these moments was recorded by Ralph the monk, a loyal chronicler who might have been the first to spot the boy's indomitable spirit. The child, Ralph wrote, stood as though he bore the weight of a kingdom. Of course, standing straight was the easy part. Surviving would prove much harder. In 1034, Duke Robert decided to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land. Why? Perhaps a mix of religious zeal, guilt over his past sins, and a dash of wanderlust. Before he departed, he summoned his vassals and presented his 8-year-old son as his heir. The lords murmured but grudgingly accepted. After all, who could argue with a duke on a holy mission? Robert's journey was arduous. By the time he reached Nicaea, in what is now Turkey, he fell gravely ill. Rumors would later swirl. Was it poison? Assassination? The truth was likely far less dramatic. Medieval maladies didn't need much help to finish someone off. On July 2, 1035, Robert died, leaving behind an 8-year-old boy to inherit a throne surrounded by enemies. When news of Robert's death reached Normandy, the duchy erupted like a shaken hornet's nest. Young William, now Duke of Normandy, became the target of every ambitious lord with a grudge or a dream of power. Among his most dangerous enemies were Ralph de Wacy, a scheming uncle with a penchant for treachery; William of Talot, another uncle who believed he should be duke; Guy of Brion, a cousin whose ambition was matched only by his arrogance; Thurson-Gause, a rebellious lord who treated the boy duke with contempt. To make matters worse, assassination attempts became a recurring theme in William's life. His guardians moved him constantly, keeping him one step ahead of the daggers aimed at his back. Despite the chaos, William proved more than a match for his enemies. With the help of loyal advisors like Ralph the monk and the backing of a few steadfast lords, he learned the art of survival. Every betrayal taught him caution. Every battle honed his skills. By the time he turned 15 in 1042, he was ready to rule in his own right. His first act as a young duke? Reclaiming the family stronghold at Falaise from the rebellious Thurson-Gause. At just 15, William led a small but determined force to besiege the castle. His strategy was simple but effective. Starve the rebels into submission. Within weeks, the fortress fell, and William had his first taste of victory. William's greatest early challenge came in 1047, when his cousin, Guy of Brion, claimed the duchy for himself. Backed by several Norman lords, Guy sought to overthrow William. The young duke, now in his early 20s, knew he couldn't win alone. He appealed to Henry I of France, who agreed to support him. The decisive battle took place near Caen at Valais-Dunes. William's forces, though smaller, were disciplined and fiercely loyal. Guy's larger army, by contrast, was a fractious mix of mercenaries and rebellious lords. As the battle raged, William's cavalry outflanked Guy's forces, sowing chaos among their ranks. By the end of the day, Guy was in retreat, and William stood victorious. Following his victory, William imposed a truce of God on the Norman nobles. This medieval concept, championed by the church, required lords to swear oaths of peace and refrain from warring with one another. It was a bold move, one that cemented William's authority while also restoring a semblance of stability to Normandy. By the late 1040s, however, he was busy cementing his authority over the land. His secret weapon? His half-brother, Odo, who, in 1049, swapped the sword for a bishop's crook as the newly minted Bishop of Bayeux. Some might call this nepotism. William called it strategy. Odo's new role didn't just bolster William's grip over western Normandy, it sent a clear message to his enemies. This family sticks together, so mess with one of us, and you'll have us all to contend with. William wasn't just a man of family ties, he was a man of wise counsel. Enter William Fitz-Osbern and Roger de Montgomery. two loyal advisors whose knack for strategy and governance rivaled even the savviest of courtly plotters. Their inclusion in William's inner circle gave the impression of a stable and coherent government, quite the feat in an era when stability was as rare as a tame Viking. These two would prove indispensable when William decided many years later to turn his attention toward a little place called England. By 1050, William decided it was secure his dynasty and turned his thoughts to marriage. He set his sights on Matilda of Flanders, daughter of Count Baldwin of Flanders, one of the most powerful rulers in Northern Europe. The match was a masterstroke of diplomacy. Not only did it bolster William's political alliances, but it also produced a brood of 9 children, 4 sons and 5 daughters, 2 of whom, Robert and William, would go on to rule England. Legend has it that Matilda initially refused William's proposal, citing his illegitimacy. William, never one to take no for an answer, reportedly rode to Flanders, found Matilda, and threw her off her horse. An unconventional approach to romance, but hey, it worked. The union wasn't just a marriage, it was a merger of powerhouses, setting the stage for William's ambitions to expand beyond Normandy. To understand William's eventual claim to the English throne, one must rewind to the early 1010s. Back then, England was a battlefield for Norse ambitions. Sweyn Forkbeard of Denmark usurped King Ethelred, but Ethelred's son Edmund Ironside briefly reclaimed the throne, only to lose it to Sweyn's son, Cnut, in 1016. Cnut's reign birthed a North Atlantic empire that spanned England, Denmark, and Norway, but his death in 1035 threw the kingdom into disarray. It was during this period of chaos that Edward, Ethelred's exiled son, found refuge in Normandy, under the protection of William's grandfather. Edward, raised among the Norman elite, never forgot this kindness. When he became King of England in 1042, he reportedly promised the English crown to William, a promise born of gratitude and, perhaps, political convenience. The fact that Edward had no legitimate heir only made the promise more enticing. Back in Normandy, William wasn't exactly twiddling his thumbs. His early alliance with King Henry I of France soured in the 1050s, leading to a series of invasions of Normandy. Henry underestimated the young duke, and in 1057, William decisively defeated the French king at the Battle of Varaville. The victory marked a turning point, solidifying William's control over Normandy and allowing him to expand his influence into the county of Maine by 1063. But William wasn't just a warrior, he was a builder. In 1062, he and Matilda began constructing the iconic Abbey of Sainte Trinité in Saône. The abbey was a blend of Romanesque and Gothic architecture, symbolizing a world on the cusp of change, a perfect metaphor for William's era. By 1064, William turned his attention westward to Brittany, embroiling himself in the Breton-Norman War. Curiously, this war also involved Harold Godwinson, the most powerful noble in England. Harold allegedly traveled to Normandy to reaffirm Edward's promise to William, only to find himself swearing an oath of loyalty to the Norman duke. The Bayeux Tapestry immortalizes this moment, depicting Harold with his hand on sacred relics as he vows to support William's claim to the English throne. The Bayeux Tapestry, a 70-meter-long embroidered masterpiece, serves as both propaganda and history. It vividly portrays the events leading up to 1066, when William would finally make his move on England. Housed today in the town of Bayeux, it's a striking reminder of how William shaped his legacy, not just through battles, but through storytelling. For the moment, however, William had to bide his time. Edward the Confessor lived into the 1060s, and the promise of the English throne remained just that, a promise. Meanwhile, William strengthened his hold over northern France, defeated rivals, and laid the groundwork for what would become one of the most famous invasions in history. With every strategic marriage, every battle won, and every abbey constructed, William inched closer to his ultimate goal, the crown of England. As history would soon reveal. The mid-1060s, the tranquil countryside of Normandy. William, Duke of Normandy, and Harold Godwinson, a rising star in the Anglo-Saxon court, met under curious circumstances. Harold, perhaps on an errand of diplomacy or a misadventure of shipwreck, found himself in Normandy. William extended all the Norman hospitality, fine wine, lavish feasts, and oh yes, a slyly orchestrated oath. In a twist worthy of a Shakespearean tragedy, Harold swore allegiance to William as the future King of England. Whether this oath was made willingly, under duress, or as part of a cunning Norman trick remains unclear, but its implications would echo ominously in 1066. By late 1065, Edward the Confessor, pious, childless, and pushing 60, was fading fast. Rumors swirled through the corridors of Westminster as the old king slipped into a coma. "The crown?" whispered the lords, glancing nervously at one another. Edward had been maddeningly vague about his successor. Was it William, his distant Norman cousin? Harold, the kingdom's mightiest earl? Or some other claimant lurking in the shadows? On January 5, 1066, Edward passed into legend, leaving behind a nation on the brink of chaos. His indecision over the succession was the equivalent of tossing a lit torch into a room filled with kindling. Harold, seizing the moment, or rather the crown, was proclaimed king by the Anglo-Saxon Wheaton the very next day. But was this wise? Harold's coronation lit a fire in Normandy. To William, it was a betrayal of the solemn oath Harold had sworn on relics of saints. And across the sea in Norway, a warrior king named Harald Hardrada sharpened his sword. The throne of England was suddenly a prize for the bold. William, always the schemer, had been preparing for this moment for years. Normandy buzzed with activity as shipwrights hammered away, crafting hundreds of longships and specialized horse transports, a technological marvel imported from the Byzantine Empire. Unlike the Viking longships of old, these vessels could carry war horses across the channel, ensuring William's knights would ride into battle fully equipped. William also reached out to allies and vassals across northern France. From Brittany to Flanders, lords pledged their men and resources, some enticed by promises of land and glory, others compelled by William's formidable charisma, or threats. By the summer of 1066, Normandy was a fortress-turned-war machine. Meanwhile, Harold Godwinson's troubles weren't confined to Normandy. His estranged brother Tostig, former Earl of Northumbria, had an axe to grind. Quite literally. Banished from England after a northern rebellion, Tostig schemed from exile in Flanders, raiding England's southern coast with mercenaries in tow. But Tostig wasn't content to be a mere thorn in Harold's side. Seeking a greater ally, he journeyed to Norway to meet King Harald Hardrada, a man with an unquenchable thirst for conquest. Hardrada, a towering figure of Viking legend, had fought across Europe, served as a Varangian guard in Byzantium, and lived to tell the tale. When Tostig proposed they join forces to claim the English throne, Hardrada agreed. His reasons? Ambition, glory, and a chance to carve his name into history. In September 1066, Hardrada and Tostig landed in northern England with a massive force, 10,000 warriors and 300 ships. Their initial raids were devastating, culminating in a victory at Fulford on September 20th. York seemed ripe for the taking, but Harold Godwinson, displaying his characteristic resolve, marched north with astonishing speed. Covering over 180 miles in less than a week, his forces arrived at Stamford Bridge on September 25th, catching the Norwegians off guard. The ensuing battle was brutal and decisive. Hardrada and Tostig fell, their dreams of conquest shattered. Of the 300 ships that had carried the Norse army, fewer than 30 were needed to carry the survivors home. Harold had triumphed, but his respite would be short-lived. While Harold was battling in the north, William launched his invasion from Normandy. On September 28th, his fleet landed at Pevensey unopposed, a testament to Harold's absence. Establishing a base at Hastings, William began devastating the surrounding countryside. It was psychological warfare at its finest, designed to draw Harold southward. And Harold obliged. Fresh from his northern victory, he raced south to confront William, barely allowing his troops time to rest or regroup. This haste, while heroic, would prove a fatal error. William of Normandy, a man known for his steely resolve and sharp wit, had landed on English shores in 1066 with an army numbering between 7,000 and 10,000 men. This wasn't some ragtag crew of farmhands armed with pitchforks. Oh no. These were Norman heavy cavalry, the tanks of the 11th century, battle-hardened warriors in chainmail who could charge through enemy lines like a hot knife through butter. On the other side of the battlefield, Harold Godwinson, King of England, was rallying his own army. Harold's men were no slouches, but they were utterly exhausted. They had just marched a marathon-worthy distance to Yorkshire, fought and defeated a Viking army at Stamford Bridge, and then rushed south at breakneck speed to face this new invader. If Harold's army had frequent marcher miles, they'd be platinum members by now. The morning of October 14, 1066, dawned over the hill near the aptly named town of Battle. Harold's forces had taken the high ground, a prime position for defense. Behind them loomed the dense forest of the Weald, a natural barrier, but also a trap if things went south. Harold's famed shield wall, a living fortress of interlocked shields and bristling spears, stretched across the ridge, an intimidating sight for any attacker. William's forces, however, had a slight problem. They were at the bottom of the hill, a precarious position for any general. But William wasn't just any general. He was a master tactician with a flair for the dramatic. With a mix of infantry, archers, and cavalry, he orchestrated a symphony of warfare that would outlast the sun that day. As the battle raged, William devised a cunning plan that would go down in military history. He ordered his troops to feign retreat, a classic, "Oh no, we're running away" move. Harold's troops, perhaps thinking this was their moment of triumph, broke formation to chase after the seemingly fleeing Normans. Big mistake. The Normans wheeled around and struck back with devastating force, like a coiled snake waiting to strike. Throughout the day, William's archers rained death upon the English forces. His cavalry, the pride of Norman warfare, smashed into Harold's shield wall, breaking it down piece by piece. Late in the day, during one of these feigned retreats, Harold met his end. An arrow, perhaps guided by fate or William's excellent planning, struck him in the eye. In the chaos that followed, Harold was cut down, his body surrounded by the corpses of his loyal housecarls. With their king dead, the English forces disintegrated. Some fled, others surrendered. By sunset, the field was William's, littered with the dead and dying, but victorious. Victory at Hastings was monumental. But William wasn't about to march into Westminster Abbey the next day and plop a crown on his head. Oh no, the lords of the Witan in London had other ideas. They declared a new king, Edgar Atheling, a teenager with a decent bloodline but no actual power. William, ever the strategist, took a cautious approach. Instead of storming London, he secured the south of England, capturing Dover, Canterbury, and Winchester. By isolating Edgar's supporters in the capital, William slowly tightened the noose. The boy king's reign, if you can call it that, lasted mere weeks. By December, Edgar and his supporters met with William and agreed to a peaceful abdication. On Christmas Day 1066, William was crowned King of England in Westminster Abbey. It should have been a solemn and dignified affair, but the day took a chaotic turn. As shouts of acclamation rang out from the abbey, William's soldiers outside panicked, thinking their new king had been assassinated. In their frenzy, they set fire to nearby houses, creating a spectacle of smoke and flame that would have been better suited to a Viking raid. Amid this chaos, William of Normandy became William the Conqueror, the ruler of a kingdom forever changed. The Norman conquest wasn't just a change of leadership, it was a seismic shift in English society. Thousands of Anglo-Saxon and Danish nobles fled, replaced by Norman lords who brought their culture, laws, and language. Anglo-Norman, a dialect of Old French, became the language of the ruling class and the courts, leaving a lasting imprint on English. Under William's reign, England saw the centralization of its government and the foundation of the common law system. Castles sprang up across the land, symbols of Norman dominance and fortresses against rebellion. As historian Richard Southern put it, no country in Europe had undergone such a radical transformation in such a short time. The events of 1066 weren't just the end of one era, they were the beginning of another, one that would shape the English-speaking world for centuries to come. England in 1066 was a patchwork quilt of fields, forests, and feudal lords. Amidst this pastoral scene, there was one less than idyllic detail. Slavery. It wasn't a new concept for the Anglo-Saxons. They'd been enslaving each other long before William the Conqueror showed up. But by the time William and his crew swaggered ashore, slavery was already losing its grip, much like Harold's hold on the crown at Hastings. The Normans, it turned out, were not fans of slavery. Oh, they liked lording over people, but the whole owning humans outright thing? too barbaric, even for them. So, after the conquest, the number of slaves listed in the Domesday Book, a sort of medieval census/land grab manual, dropped to around 28,000. Sure, record-keeping back then was about as reliable as a weather vane in a hurricane, but the trend was clear. Freedom was in the air, or at least a reduced chance of being sold with the cattle. By the 12th century, slavery had faded even further, as the Normans embraced a new motto: oppress, don't possess. Fellow Christians, they reasoned, were off-limits for enslavement, and before long, England had effectively swapped shackles for serfdom. Slightly less grim, but still no picnic. If there's one thing William liked more than a good battle, it was a good reorganization. Upon becoming king, he took one look at the English church and decided it needed a Norman makeover. Enter Lanfranc of Canterbury, a monk so brilliant and disciplined, he probably alphabetized his prayers. Lanfranc teamed up with William of Bayeux, another church heavy hitter, to whip the English clergy into shape. They turned the chaotic patchwork of local churches into a streamlined, centralized institution. But here's the twist. While they kept the Pope in Rome in the loop, they didn't let him run the show. This independent streak foreshadowed England's later break from Rome, proving that even in the 11th century, the English had a knack for arguing with the continent. Now about those castles. Before William arrived, the Anglo-Saxons built wooden forts that a determined pig could knock over. The Normans, ever the overachievers, replaced them with stone castles so imposing they made the Tower of London look like a garden shed. These were no mere houses, they were statements of power, complete with murder holes and arrow slits. Take Robert de Beaumont, for instance. A staunch ally of William, he ended up with over 90 manors and a title to match. It was like winning the medieval lottery, except instead of a check, you got a chunk of Warwickshire and a mandate to keep the locals in line. Meanwhile, William Fitzosborne was busy in the West Midlands, building castles and swatting away rebels like a medieval exterminator. His crowning achievement was Carisbrooke Castle, a fortress so formidable it later became King Charles I's prison. Talk about leaving a legacy. Fitzosborne might have risen even higher if he hadn't decided to moonlight as a wannabe Count of Flanders, a career pivot that ended badly at the Battle of Cassel in 1071. And then came the rebellions. The north of England, a hotbed of resistance, didn't take kindly to Norman rule. In 1069, Edgar Atheling, the last surviving member of the Anglo-Saxon royal house, teamed up with some Danes and Scots to stir up trouble. William responded with the infamous harrying of the north, a scorched earth campaign so brutal it left parts of northern England looking like a post-apocalyptic wasteland. Chronicler Orderic Vitalis described William's approach as bringing famine and the sword to the north. The Domesday Book confirmed the devastation, showing land values in the region plummeted for years afterward. Tens of thousands died or fled, and the population in some areas dropped by as much as 75%. William didn't just conquer the north, he broke its spirit. But William wasn't all blood and thunder, he had a softer, savvier side. To justify his conquest, he commissioned glowing accounts of his rule, like William of Jumie's Deeds of the Dukes of the Normans. Meanwhile, Pope Alexander II ordered penance for the conquest's violence. William, ever the opportunist, turned this into a PR victory by founding Battle Abbey on the very site where Harold fell at Hastings. Nothing says divine approval like a giant abbey built with blood money. But here's the twist. After securing England, William spent most of his reign across the Channel in Normandy. Why? Because in the 11th century, England wasn't the glittering jewel we envision today. France was where the action was, culturally, politically, and economically. Plus, unrest kept flaring up in his French domains, demanding William's attention. Back in England, dissent brewed. One of the most colorful figures of resistance was Hereward the Wake, who turned the marshy fens into his personal playground for rebellion. Alongside Danish troops, he made life miserable for William's men. The terrain was a nightmare for Norman heavy cavalry, leaving William fuming like a medieval CEO whose siege budget had just doubled. The solution? A pontoon bridge. Ingenious, right? With this makeshift path, William stormed Ely and crushed the rebellion. Some rebels were executed, others pardoned, and Hereward, well, depending on which version you prefer, he either slipped into exile, or became a medieval folk hero. As if rebellions weren't enough, William's own family added spice to his life. His eldest son, Robert, had aspirations that outgrew his patience. A quarrel led to Robert's temporary exile, a preview of the familial chaos that would plague the Normans for years to come. William also left a lasting architectural legacy, the Tower of London. Built as a fortress to dominate the city, it sent a clear message to the unruly Londoners who had initially resisted his rule. Don't even think about it. With its imposing walls, the White Tower became both a symbol of Norman authority and a warning beacon for any would-be rebels. In the 1080s, whispers of invasion by Denmark's King Canute IV sent shivers down Norman spines. To prepare, William's forces scorched the earth in eastern England, leaving the land barren and its people destitute. But fate intervened. Canute died before he could set sail, sparing England further bloodshed. As William's reign waned, rumors swirled of a potential invasion of Ireland. However, this ambition never materialized, leaving us to wonder what might have been if the Conqueror had turned his sights westward. In the summer of 1087, William the Conqueror, now more William the Stubborn to his increasingly impatient courtiers, decided that retirement wasn't for conquerors. Though his armor may have been rusting and his bones creaking, the fire of ambition still burned within him. So, like a seasoned knight reliving his glory days, William launched one last campaign. His target? Paris, the jewel of the French crown, a city that had eluded his iron grasp for decades. But fate, as it so often does, had other plans. During the siege of Montes, northwest of Paris, William suffered an injury that was both tragic and oddly comical, if you weren't him. While inspecting the battlefield on horseback, his steed bucked, slamming the saddle pommel into his stomach with all the grace of a blacksmith's hammer. The great conqueror, who had survived countless battles, now found himself felled by his own horse. As one chronicler might have quipped, Paris didn't kill him, but his saddle certainly tried. The injury was severe, his abdomen torn and his spirit shaken. His men whisked him back to Normandy, first to Rouen and then to the Abbey of St. Gervais, where he lay in agony. But this was William, a man who had faced down rebellions, invasions, and betrayal. Even on his deathbed, he sought to maintain control, issuing orders, settling disputes, and, if rumors are to be believed, glaring at his sons with the intensity of a dying lion, daring his cubs to challenge him. On September 9, 1087, at around 60 years old, William the Conqueror breathed his last. The man who had united Normandy and England under his banner, who had reshaped the very fabric of medieval Europe, succumbed not to sword or arrow, but to the creeping hand of mortality. As his courtiers mourned, or pretended to, given the inheritance drama brewing like a pot of overboiled stew, his body was prepared for transport to Caen. There, in the Abbey of St. Etienne, William would finally rest. Or so everyone hoped. William's succession plan was about as straightforward as a Norman castle's labyrinthine hallways. His eldest son, Robert Curthose, had long been designated Duke of Normandy, a decision made back in 1063, when Robert still had the charm of youth and not the irritating rebellious streak that earned him the nickname Curthose, short stockings. England, however, was another matter. His second son, William Rufus, inherited the throne, his red hair and fiery temperament fitting for a king. The youngest, Henry, received a pittance compared to his brothers. But Henry, ever the strategist, must have smirked quietly to himself, knowing history often favored the patient. It wasn't long before these brothers, bound by blood but divided by ambition, turned on each other. Robert and William squabbled like children over a toy, while Henry, biding his time, would eventually snatch the crown in 1100 after William Rufus's mysterious death. In the end, William's legacy wasn't just his empire, but the chaotic sibling rivalry that echoed through England and Normandy for decades. If William's life was marked by triumph, his funeral was a comedy of errors worthy of a Shakespearean farce. As his body was being lowered into the tomb at the Abbey of St. Etienne, a local peasant burst into the ceremony, claiming the land on which the abbey stood was his by ancestral right. Nothing says, "Rest in peace," like a property dispute. But the real drama unfolded when it became apparent that William's tomb was too small for his body. In their desperation to fit him in, the pallbearers forced his corpse into the space, rupturing it. The resulting stench reportedly cleared the room faster than any enemy army ever had. And thus, William the Conqueror, feared by kings and nobles alike, was laid to rest amid chaos and odor. If you thought William's troubles ended with his burial, think again. His tomb would face more disturbances than an English pub on game night. In 1522, Pope Adrian VI ordered an exhumation for reasons lost to history, perhaps just to ensure the conqueror hadn't risen to reclaim Normandy. Things took a darker turn during the French Wars of Religion in the 1560s. A mob of Calvinists, suspecting the local Catholics had hidden treasure in the tomb, ransacked it. By the time they were done, much of William's remains had been destroyed, leaving only fragments of a man whose legacy had once towered over Europe. For all the chaos surrounding his death and burial, William's influence endured. He left England with a blueprint for governance that would define its history for centuries. Under his reign, English became the language of the people, while French dominated the courts and aristocracy. His campaigns in Wales and Scotland laid the groundwork for England's future ambitions, while his ties to Normandy forged a continental legacy that would lead to centuries of conflict with France. Even in death, William the Conqueror refused to fade quietly into history. His life, filled with warfare, schemes, and unrelenting ambition, set the stage for the medieval world we know today, a legacy as enduring as it was turbulent. And so we bid farewell to the conqueror who could tame kingdoms but not his own funeral. William the Conqueror, a man whose story is as unforgettable as it is